Alright, we're waiting for one more panelist for the time being, but I think it's a good idea to actually take this quick survey right here. So if we can do like a quick show of hands, who is here to learn what game engines are about? So if you can raise your hand. Okay, a fair number. Who is here to learn what tools are available to make games? Alright, that's about what I expected. And who is here to learn what kind of game engines there are out there? Okay, a couple out there. So that tells me that I should probably stick. There's a slide that I deliberately, as a joke, I deliberately stuffed a lot of game engines onto. Yes, but I promise we'll stick to that slide a little longer so that we can at least explain how it's sorted out and what the heck each of them are. Well, not all of them, but enough of them, yes, so that we can actually have those questions answered as well. But anyways, welcome to the panel on the secret world of game engines. My name is Taro Mia.
I'm Logan Khan.
Hi, I'm Frank. Of course, we're all pretty much indie devs, and obviously we use a lot of game engines to make games, so we thought this would be a really interesting panel to go through. What kind of
can't hear you.
Are out there? You cannot hear me.
That one's going to go okay.
This one's
turn up the mic a bit?
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
How about this? Yes. Okay.
Sweet. So our quick agenda is quickly go through what is the game engine, and briefly talk about its history, and then we're also going to go into a little more in depth about what's involved in selecting a game engine before we're going on to the question and answer section. So what is a game engine? This is, I believe this is CryEngine right here if you're interested. If you've heard of the term, kind of run Crysis 3, now you know where that's from. But what is a game engine? A game engine, of course, games in general require a lot of different technical frameworks happening all at the same time. This includes graphics, audio, user interfaces, especially menus, physics, AI, lots of different inputs, controllers, mouse, keyboard, online networking, level editing, scripting, and oh, so many more things. So the purpose of a game engine is to figure out how to marry all those elements together into a simple and easy to use interface. It's also worth noting that the grand majority of game engines do not, create anything particular in a game. We will be talking about a few that does, which is why at the very bottom there, some of them do. But most of the time, game engines are kind of designed to be generalist. Second, they're not very good at creating 3D or 3D models or 2D images. They're not really made for that purpose. They're made for taking 3D models or 2D images and pulling them on the screen.
Yeah, it's a good collection of tools that takes your art, your original art, and processes it into the actual game content.
Correct. Thank you. And same story for sound and music. Long story short, if you're going to be using a game engine, they're expecting that you're already well versed in using tools like Photoshop, Maya, VFXR, Audacity, FL Studios, and so forth. So
there are exceptions to that, though.
Yes, there are plenty of exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's what they expect. All right, this is Unreal 4, and we're going to talk about brief history. It's kind of weird because there's no single standpoint of where game engine started in. There's three different sort of worlds that was born. The first one, obviously, the console era, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, where basically a lot of game studios were kind of making their own game engines from the first place. And consequently, they were optimizing their game engines for a specific platform. Porting was just not a viable option at the time, so you had a lot of exclusives during these sort of NES to the Dreamcast period. In the PC world, a different emerging market was happening, where companies like Epic, id, and Valve were creating all these own engines for their games, but they were also encouraging modding, right? So they said hey, we've already created this tool for editing, editing levels and so forth. We'll let the public be able to use that tool and kind of modify the game in any sort of way they wanted it, even the scripting interface, so on and so forth. So obviously, because of PC, there's so many different hardwares out there. All these engines were kind of designed with being able to port between different platforms in mind, because there's just so many different hardware and so many different configurations to handle. And already for PC world, at the very least, there was a significant number of emerging big players. But there's also the indie world. And the indie world in particular, the Flash period was probably the most influential, where a lot of people were putting up, free online games. Most of them, again, in Flash. Some of them actual standalone games. You can see two of them right here: Cave Story and I think Mondo Medicals, which was one of the developer of Hotline Miami. This was one of the first couple of games they made so many, by the way. These were one of the couple of games that they made. Because of that, a couple of game engines was kind of born for the indie space, and a lot of people started using that because, let's face it, it's easier, and a lot of developers are lazy like me.
It's a matter of how many resources you have,
right,
and how much time you have. So if you have something that can cut down a lot of your development time, you have to do it if you want to release an indie game.
But Adobe Flash was obviously a big and major one. Game Maker Studio was kind of born from the indie stage era and just kind of became more and more popular over time. And also a fairly little known game engine called Unity was released for Macs, and only on the Macs, weirdly enough, for quite a long while. That had its own cult following because
With only the JavaScript scripting.
oh yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I would also mention. I also want to make a quick mention that the open source movement was on the rise. It was kind of like a completely separate thing because there was a sort of merging between the indie team and the open source team because the open source people were like, let's all be about sharing stuff, and the indie team were also all for let's all be about sharing stuff and making ourselves a lot better. So you have these three completely separate worlds: consoles, PC, indies. But we know today that they're all just kind of mishmashed into this big honkin'. All right, every game engine is now focused on all three of these markets. When did that happen? Huh?
And mobile also.
Yes. What happened? Well, the Xbox happened. Microsoft basically made a PC that looks like a console and called it a day. But the good news of that is that now a lot of the PC game engines could actually build to a console, which in this case would be the Xbox. And now now that they got their game onto the Xbox, they have a motivation to now port it to PS2, and then eventually to the future consoles: PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, so on and so forth. And the rest you can call history. On top of that, Microsoft also made another clever move to really open up their console by exposing the XNA framework, which became the basis for a lot of indie games that was created during this era, like Braid and whatnot. And so you have this one single console to rule them all, to figure out how to merge these three separated markets. On top of that, only a couple of years later, mobile became a hot thing. And that's where Unity particularly came to shine. Unity was pretty much the go-to game engine for mobile games. And then they're like, hey, maybe we can try capturing the rest of the console markets as well. So that's how probably a lot of you now know the game engine, because it's been so used for a million other things. Obviously, Unreal is a major player that just kind of grew naturally out of this evolution. So today, game engines just broadly fall under these four different categories. Again, this is a very broad stroke. There's plenty of edge cases, and I'm not attempting to say they always fall under these four categories. But, it's a good basis to get started. One, there's a lot of 3D generalist game engines. These are usually where you hear about the big players, including Unreal 4 with Unreal Tournament, Gears of War, so on and so forth. Unity, my goodness, there's so many games made out of that. Godot 3 is a fairly recent and upcoming open source game engine. The Amazon Lumberyard, CryEngine, they're right now kind of one and the same thing. But Lumberyard is trying to be its own distinct thing, and it is free, so why not check it out? And Zenko was something I was surprised to find. I'll probably go into a little bit into that in more detail, probably towards the Q&A section. But keep in mind, let's pull a bookmark on that game engine. Another one is the easy-to-learn indie game engines. They mainly focus on 2D. They're honest. When I talk about easy to use, they kind of start with an assumption that a lot of people don't know how to program and are based around that, well, whole philosophy. So, Game Maker Studio is one of them, although you can't program in Game Maker.
There's a lot of like drag and drop,
Right.
not just visuals, but also logic.
Okay. Construct, in particular, I like to teach Construct 2 and Construct 3 is also incredibly easy to use, incredibly easy to learn as well, if you don't know how to make games at all. Blender, sorta, I don't recommend.
I wouldn't call it easy.
But it is technically possible to not learn programming and still manage to make a game out of Blender, technically. And then there's the specialized game engines that focuses on one very specific game genre. Probably a huge number of you already know about RPG Maker, and holy crap, there's a lot of different versions of it. RPG Maker is on. Ren'Py is up and coming, becoming ridiculously popular actually for visual novels. I just recently found out Adventure Game Studio. I haven't used this, I can't say too much about it, but that's from playing quick game adventures, with tech adventures, and so forth. And then the last and final category, kind of a remnant from the indie era, is the programming frameworks. So these not only expect you to know programming, but you flat out, it shows you no level editor or anything like that. You kind of have to make all those tools yourselves. But Love is a fairly popular one. I'm surprised Pygame is still in the game. Haxflix, did I spell that correctly, Will? Is it Haxflixel or Haxflix?
That's correct.
Oh, okay, cool. Haxflixel is also super duper popular. Mind you, they do make it a lot easier to make games by a large measure. I might be, unfortunately, I didn't research too much on Haxflixel, so you can correct me on anything I'm wrong from all the panelists, including Will as well. But anyways, so that's just a broad, quick list. And finally, we're going to talk about the core that it sounds like most of you are here for, which is learning how to make and choosing a game engine. And I'd like to take it to, before I do that, excuse me, sorry, I forgot about the slide. So for those who haven't actually started learning how to use a game engine before, or learn how to make a game engine at all, there are a couple of prerequisites that you definitely should at least learn the terminologies for. If you can also remember the formulas, that would also be really good. But since most of the time you're using a computer and you're letting the computer do the math solving for you, you don't actually have to be able to, be good at math per se. But anyways, some prerequisites. Obviously, you need to know how to use a computer. It's just a reality of being able to make something for a computer. You should probably have some basic knowledge on geometry. These are simple terms like Cartesian coordinates. If you know your x, y coordinates, or if you, for 3D world, x, y, and z, then you already know Cartesian coordinates. Quickly looking through the room, it looks like the grand majority of you are well past high school. So when we're talking about geometry here, we're talking like high school level geometry, not college level. Physics, same story. High school level physics is enough to get you started. So long as you understand and know what all these terminologies stand for, force, velocity, acceleration, mass, you're good to go. 3D and 2D, 3D and or 2D digital terminologies, preferably both, to be completely honest. You're probably going to want to know what the term lossy and lossless stands for, what sprite sheets are. And for 3D, my goodness, there's a lot of terms. You better need to know what models, textures, and materials are supposed to mean. They're not hard to Google. It's honestly, these kind of terminologies are something that you easily just go through a quick tutorial on how to make a 3D model, and they'll go through all the terminologies for you. Same story for digital audio terminologies. Probably you'll need to know what the heck volume is, which I'm sure everyone already knows. But pitch is a little more interesting. Lossy and lossless is also really good to know the difference. And finally, what you want to make. When I say what you want to make, the more important part is knowing how, what size teams usually makes that game genre and how long it usually takes to make that game. You have to obviously cater or make sure that your expectations are set properly. So, I mean, a common thing that we're being told is, hey, I want to make a super awesome, gigantic MMORPG. And that is a moment where a lot of us just start sweating golf balls, because it's like, no, that takes about a team of 100 for 5 years to make, right? So, like I said, just long story short, a lot of networking games in particular are fairly difficult to make. Not difficult in the sense that, not difficult in the sense of setting up, it's a well-trodden ground per se, but difficult in the sense of getting it stable and being able to handle a lot of edge cases. So they're also really hard to test too. But anyways, so long as you know you have proper expectations on what you want to make, there should be no problems in going through any of these. All right.
But one thing to add that's really important about this slide is that all of this comes with experience also. So like there's a ton of terminology that you definitely won't know when you first start getting into game engines, even the really big, quote-unquote easy ones. But as you run into terms that you're not familiar with, like what's a quaternion, or what's a vector and stuff like this, and you need to at least read the Wikipedia page or something about them,
Right.
so that later when you have a problem that you want to solve, even though the game engine does it for you, you still need to be able to pull up the terminology and be like, oh, I need to add force to this, or I need to do this or that. And this is, that all comes with experience. Same with the scope. So like knowing what you want to make and how long it takes. As you make more games, hopefully start small, you get a feel for how long that takes, and then you can kind of expand from there.
All right, so why make your own game engine?
Yeah, so it kind of is a tangent, but it branches off the last point, which is
Cat, excuse me.
So what Taro was talking about before is you have to know what you want to make, and that is really the most important thing, whether you're using a pre-made engine, whether you're creating your own engine, anything. Even if you're not even trying to make a full game, if you're trying to make a prototype, you have to really know what you want to make. So I find a good exercise is to imagine that you're making your own game engine. Right? That is an option. People do that. For example, Frank, who's an awesome programmer, he will show off his custom game engine demo later. But there's a certain amount of detail you have to figure out in order to figure out this question. So so learning exercise, it's really important to be able to, if you want to understand like what are all the aspects of a game engine. Like we listed tons of terminology in the last few slides, right? Like there's no way you can just read a book and learn about that. You kind of have to get in there and get in the guts to learn about it. It's a big challenge, which is awesome if you like programming. If you want to learn programming, even though it's a difficult thing, it's not a bad idea, not that we learn. If you have a game that's very content heavy, so maybe there's not many mechanics, but there's a ton of content. So like maybe you'll see like a lot of mobile games have maybe 1 or 2 controls, and they have like 300 levels, and that's it. So a game like that, writing your own engine for that, you're not competing with Unity or Unreal or these big ones. So it's actually pretty manageable if you start using certain tools. And when you do that, you can make more unique mechanics, third point, because the big generalized engines like Tara was talking about, they're not really specific to any game. They're kind of just there for you to make like kind of normal quote unquote games that you've seen before. But if you want to make a game that no one's ever seen, writing your own engine kind of helps with that. And so when you think about this, like, is your game like really super unique and to fit into a box? You know, you can kind of think of that, and you can consider writing your own engine, or at least if you're using an existing engine, you can, you know that it's going to be an extra challenge. Like, your game engine won't do everything for you because some stuff has to be prevented. And that's a cool thing. I mean, that's a good motivator when you're making your own game. It's like, whoa, this is actually new and fresh. This last one is kind of a technical, nerdy kind of thing, but I think it's really important, which is where you have the full control over the source code of the engine. So, you know, we talk about Unreal and Unity and stuff like that. Those are really huge, multi-million-dollar companies with the source code to those engines. They don't want to give you access to it. So if there's a bug in the engine, which there is, very often, you can't do anything about it. And it's really, really annoying. And basically, if you can't solve that bug, sometimes your game is dead in the water, or you have to figure something out, or you have to change the mechanics. So you're like limited in this box. Whereas if you have your own engine, you have total control. Yeah, so that's a cool thing to consider. Even like open source engines like Haxflixel, you do have all the source code, so you can change it here and there. But when you go to update the engine, or you want to pull in new updates, there's conflicts and stuff. Yeah, just interesting things to consider, especially if you're a programmer.
I want to add a quick anecdote. I had the experience of going through a bug where the tile map editor in Unity did not have, their colliders did not work. That was very frustrating, and I had to rewrite the collider system. Yeah, that happens very often, where you're like, oh, this engine does everything. Look at this list of features. And you go and you realize half are broken. So you're already halfway through the game, and you're like, well, I'm already in here. So now I have to rewrite all these mechanics just to get my game done, because the engine is buggy. Like, that's happened to all of us, right? Yeah. So yeah, so you might kind of end up making your own game engine anyway. I think my main point here is don't be afraid of that. Like, it's really not that bad. And there's no.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, a game engine doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to be Unreal. Every game engine doesn't have to be Unity. You can make a very small game engine. I made a HTML5 game a couple months ago, and it's all of the game code is there, and I wrote a very small game engine that's about like 2 or 3 pages of code. So it doesn't have to be a huge, like complex game engine. And so yeah, you could start simple. Just think about the core things. I want to be able to render something. I want to be able to play music and sound, and I want to control objects and physics, and just boil it down to this simplicity. I think it's a great exercise because people can do it in a week or 2. Really, it's not a lot of work. Also, I wanted to say, like, you can do something better than some of these other game engines, because like Unreal might be a huge game engine and they might have some really great engineers there and lots of money, but you can pick like one thing in your game engine that you really want to focus on and make amazing, better than them, because they can't even do stuff just because their game engine is so huge that it's a bit slow and stuff, for example. So you can make your game engine, like I'll be demoing mine later, that's a bit faster to iterate in than Unreal or anything, because they're just weighted down by this huge, massive game engine. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the speed, I didn't mention the speed, but that's a big thing also. That you should consider. Like, Unity and Unreal have all this stuff, but that means every time you press the play button, they're doing all this stuff. And you know, sure, it'll start in 10 seconds, and that's cool, but you'll see, like, Frank's engine starts in, like, not even a second.
Oh yeah, also I wanted to say the size of your executables and data. Because, like, for example, my game engine, not to brag or anything, but as with any small game engine, my game is 10 meg. That's the entire game and everything, including the engine. So with Unreal, if you want to release your game, you got it packaged up, it takes a little bit of time, and it ends up being at least 100 meg minimum. Usually quite a bit more, maybe 200 or 300 meg. And I'm not talking about for a big RPG, I'm talking about just a little small game. So when you think, oh, 100 meg, 300 meg, that's not a big deal. Well, when you start putting the source control, you start checking in, and you have to upload it, and it takes 5 minutes to upload, and then you're like, oh, I've got to change it, upload it again. It really just starts to be a bit of a pain. So keeping that package size really, really small is another really good thing about gaming.
Yeah, so this slide, I kind of listed some of the questions that I think of when I make a game engine or decide to write my own. So I do a ton of game jams. We have some game jammers out here as well, like Will, for example, who we asked questions. So when I do a game jam, I'm asking myself all these questions very often to decide whether I want to use Unity or whether I want to use just straight HTML5, or maybe I want to use like a C framework or something if I'm doing a specific thing. So yeah, so the most important question I think for me is what platform do you want to support? So Unity is awesome. To me, I think its greatest value is that it supports everything with a screen, and even something without screens, if you like audio stuff. Anyway, so yeah, so that is a huge question you want to ask yourself. Like web, you know, you have to go through JavaScript at some point if you want to get on the web. Consoles require some like low-level C, C++ kind of thing, etc., which Unity handles that also. Second thing is like what middleware do you want to use? So this is what Tara was talking about with when you're creating art, 2D or 3D art, or audio and stuff. A lot of that goes, you create the source assets in whatever editor you want, and then it sometimes goes through a middleware to process into the game. So you have to think about like, oh, do I want to use Wise or something for audio? Then you have to think about what engines actually support that. Right. Okay, yeah. So, like we're saying, engines are a really wide spectrum, so they can be super in detail, so they can have all the audio processing and image processing built in, like Unity does, or they can just be a layer for drawing something on the screen, and you have to kind of do all the visual processing, like the compressing the images and stuff like that. You have to find a way for that. So that's another important thing to look at. Next thing is like, what are the most fundamental things that your game engine needs for you to make a game? Obviously rendering. You have to think about what kind of rendering, 3D rendering, 2D rendering, all that kind of stuff. Audio networking. If you need modability, that's an important requirement that some engines support, some don't. And you might have to write your own for that, etc. And then, the other really important question is, what is the most common content creation workflow that you're trying to support? So like Frank was saying, in terms of iteration time, like Unreal, it supports so many content workflows, right? That you, for the most devs, maybe touch 10% of it for their own game, right? But every dev has their own 10%, which is why they need to support all of it. But that means when you're making your own game, there's all this other stuff weighing you down, when you really just want that small core content workflow. So you can look at other engines and think about, if you're writing your own engine, what are those workflows that you really want to hyper optimize? And that compounds on itself over development and saves you some time. And finally, all this whole exercise about thinking about making your own game engine is super useful when picking a pre-made. Because if you can answer all these questions about a theoretical engine that you would make on your own, a custom one, then it gives you a really good basis for looking at this huge list of engines that we're going to show off later and decide this one works. This one is maybe second place. This is maybe third place. These don't work. So yeah, it's a metric.
Sorry, moving over to the next part. Yes. So why use an existing game engine? I'm sure most of you probably already have answers to these. But a good reason is you don't know how to code. That's completely fair.
Can we ask who's mostly a coder or who's mostly artist? Oh, wait, let's do coders first. Oh, great.
Good.
Okay. How about artists? Cool.
Okay, good. Musicians.
How about like level design, designers in general? Okay. Great.
So you don't know how to code. Let's say you start off with that. would be, yeah, game engines are a fantastic place to start because there's a couple of them that really helps you out on that part. You need to port to multiple platforms. Let's just face it, a lot of the pre-made game engines are exceptionally good at that, and that's a really good reason to go for it. Or you're on a time constraint because it's a game jam, you're lazy like me, whatever. There are, holy crap, a lot of game engines. I put this slide as a joke, but I promise to go back to it in Q&A. But if you want to take notes. There is a logic behind how I sorted this, so I'll go back to it in the Q&A section.
I was about to ask what's the organization?
All right. So on top of what Nolan said about choosing the game engine, especially if you don't know how to code, these are a couple of questions that I'll personally start by considering. Which is one, are you willing to learn how to code if you don't know how to? If you do know how to code, that significantly opens up a lot of options. But if you don't know how to code, fortunately there's a couple of options for you, provided a couple of prerequisites are met. Second, does the game engine have to be mostly free? A lot of game engines do have a free trial, so that's what I mean by mostly. So don't expect any game engine to give you like pretty much the full set of features unless it's already open source. But just keep that in mind. What genre of games do you want to focus on? If it's one specific genre and you happen to know that there's a specialized game engine that is really fantastic at making that game engine, then I would focus on learning how to use that first. Must a game be in 3D? Can it also be in 2D? A very important question to ask because I'm just going to be blunt. Making 3D games is a lot harder than making 2D games. That extra third dimension adds a lot of complexity. So keep that in mind. Personally, if you were starting on making a game, I would recommend starting 2D myself.
That said,
right.
If you're like a 3D artist or you can make that kind of art, it might be a really good fit, especially if you know like the animation, the rigging, and everything. Like that's really where the complexity comes from. So if you know that stuff already, it could be a good fit.
Yeah.
As opposed to switching to like sprite animation and stuff, which is all other stuff.
Right. Like a lot of the 3D game engines are actually fantastic at making walking simulators, which I know a lot of people might be annoyed by that, but hey, I mean it's a niche market, it's really good. The important part is it's almost completely built specifically for that purpose, and that you can add some extra features on top. If it's a 3D game engine, how powerful does your development computer have to be? This is a significant limiting factor. The joke, can your computer run Crysis 3, is actually more relevant than you think. If it cannot run Crysis 3, it cannot run CryEngine. A lot of computers I've dealt with also cannot work with Unreal 4 either. That does require a significantly hefty computer. But a lot of computers I've worked with works with Unity just fine. So.
The other thing is like your home computer might be strong enough if you have like a gaming PC or whatever. But it's very useful to be able to run your engine on a laptop if you're coming to like a show like Magfest. You have to show off your game. You don't want to be lugging your big machine. So like the fact that some engine can run on a laptop very well is a big plus.
Notice I said 3D, most 2D game engines runs on anything, so that's usually not a problem. And finally, does it have to be open source? If you're that kind of person, I threw that in. So as a quick couple of exercises, here are some examples. Here are my answers, and here are my answers to those questions, and what I personally would recommend starting with that. So for example, if you want to make an old school Final Fantasy like JRPG games, and you don't mind paying for the license, RPG Maker MV, I believe it's like $80, is a fantastic place to start. There's a lot of games made for that. It's not hard to find on YouTube, whether it be Witch's House or so forth. But also a lot of games that are in JRPG category were made in Game Maker Studio. The most modern version is the Game Maker Studio 2. Examples include Undertale, Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, Chapter 1 of the Hoops Barkley Saga. Yes, I actually bothered to remember that entire title.
Is that even out now?
Oh no, do you
Wait.
mean 2?
Wait,
Yeah,
2023. Yeah, two's not out.
Two's not out.
The first one is fantastic.
First one is
Play it.
fantastic, yes.
Yes.
But those are good examples because like Undertale and Charles Barkley, they look like Final Fantasy RPGs, right?
Right.
But they have these little unique mechanics in there that RPG makers did not. So they had to use a more general engine like game. So that kind of thing is important.
All right, example number 2. I don't know how to program. I'm okay with making 2D games, and I'm penniless. I don't have any money. My first go-to answer, actually, believe it or not, is Construct 3. The programming interface is one of the easiest that I personally found, and I've successfully taught a lot of middle schoolers on learning how to use it. Construct 2, if it has to be offline for whatever reason. Game Maker Studio 2 is also another good place. It does have a non-programming interface, so you can get, I think even with Undertale, it was almost entirely made off of the drag and drop features. So there's a lot you can do with that. I want to make a first-person shooter, have modeling and animation knowledge and a high-end computer to match, but I don't know how to program. Believe it or not, Unreal 4, I'm serious. Unreal 4 has a feature called Blueprint, which is basically workflow.
It's like a graph.
Yeah, it's like a graph. But anyways, you can use that graph system to kind of program your way out of making a fairly complex set of features. It's very robust, and I know a lot of my 3D animator friends had really enjoyed working with it. There is a rather significant learning curve, largely in regards to importing and being able to use how to learn blueprints, importing your assets and learning how to use blueprints. But other than that, it's a perfectly viable tool. It's probably why you're seeing a lot of HD remakes of whatever a popular franchise, mostly by 3D artists.
For Unreal, if you do use Unreal 4 for this type of thing, there's a lot of like pre-made starter projects. I guess I forget what they call it exactly, but there's like a first-person shooter starter project, a third-person shooter starter project, a racing game starter project, and if you're supposed to start with that. Even I start with that, and that gives you the framework of you have a project already where you have a character and you can run around and jump and stuff, and that's like getting you like 90% of the way there. And then it's just adding content and then a couple extra features and you've got a small game.
And then let's go through these last few examples. I know how to program. I want to make a genre-busting 3D games on a mid-tier computer. Obviously, if you're saying genre-busting, then that probably means you want a generalist game engine. And mid-tier means your Unreal is probably not within your ballpark. That's Unity becomes a viable option at that point. By the way, when I say like mid-tier, like if you, I guess if you, what would you call specs? I guess check the Unreal website on what they consider is a computer that can run their game engine. So that's kind of like a significant dividing line between what your options are. But yeah, Unreal would probably be a good metric.
Yeah, you never want to be at the min spec for a game engine because that's going to be, technically you can run it, but it's going to be slow as hell. You want to be way above the min spec. As far as memory, you're going to need way more memory for your game engine than the actual game itself. You're going to need to be way fast. You're going to need a faster processor. GPU doesn't matter quite as much. Like your frame rate's not going to be as good, but the CPU is going to be really, really important for all the game engine calculations, packaging, and all that light baking stuff.
But the game engine has to be open source. Unity is not open source, so Godot 3 and Xenco probably becomes a better option. In fact, I should probably actually talk about Xenco because I just kind of randomly found it. It is actually a Japanese-made game engine. And it seems like the feature set is actually rather similar to Unreal, so that's actually pretty incredible. But check it out. I assume so, because the website is in English. And then after choosing a game engine, if you have, you obviously have to start learning how to use that tool. So here's a quick couple of steps to get started on it. By the way, about this, how to choose a game engine. Personally, I would start recommending queuing like 2 or 3 game engines rather than just committing to one, and kind of rank them in the order of what you want to learn. Because every game engine has their own way of how to use it, and there's always going to be a learning curve, but more importantly, some of them are going to fit with what you like to do, and some of them aren't. So I wrote like RPG Maker at the very top right there because it has all the features necessary to make an RPG. It's RPG Maker. But if your workflow is not the way you want it, maybe you want it to be like a really weird and quirky JRPG, then there's good reasons to believe that you might want to start looking into option 2 instead.
That's why it's a lot of the stuff comes with experience, because a lot of game engines are awesome for the first like 50% of the project, and then you get to the last 50%, and you're like, wait, I totally regret taking this engine. I want to redo. So you get that with experience. So definitely stay small and just try different things. Always try different things.
Now, obviously, when I talk about this slide, it's just a general outline. If you're trying to, for example, make a text adventure game on Twine, like, you can throw all of these out the window because it's not relevant. But anyways, stuff to search for when you're going through tutorials. How to import assets like images, models, sounds, and so forth into the game engine. A lot of game engines has a very specific workflow for that, while others is just copy and paste it in a folder. Done. So I'll look that up. It actually doesn't matter depending on what you're trying to use. Add the said imported assets into the game, be able to actually display it on the screen or play it in the game. How to move an object with a mouse, keyboard, or controller, whatever input controls you're looking for. I personally recommend starting with keyboard real quick, just to kind of get a good feel for how to make that happen. And then from there, being able to build more complexity by realizing, oh, I can support controllers this way. Setting up physics collision. This is actually quite important. Almost every single one of them has a very different workflow on this. When we talk about physics collisions, we were talking about putting boundaries between your world and figuring out how to make it so that your character does not walk through the wall. By default, it will, until you tell it that the wall is collidable.
So like literally everything in a game is physics collisions.
Yes.
Almost. Like if you're not a coder or anything, even if your game doesn't have like real life physics, all the trigger boxes like move here, do this thing, etc. All of that is run by the physics engine. So that is extremely important.
I would also learn how to create and remove objects dynamically. When I say dynamically, like when you're playing the game, you're able to push a button to make a bullet appear. Or if the bullet collides into an enemy, the enemy disappears. You're going to want to learn how to do that very quickly. And by the way, the right way to do it, because holy crap, there's a lot of wrong ways to do it where your computer will get bogged down at the fact that technically you haven't removed these enemies off of memory kind of issues. And finally, playing sound effects. Just a good idea to learn. I would then start by making a very simple game, not at all the game you actually want to make, but like something as simple as, I'm going to say nowadays Mario-ish games, mainly platformers, because it used to be that would say you should try making Pong or something like that, but a lot of these game engines are easy enough that you can literally do Pong in less than an hour. That's not really a challenge. But anyways, yeah, I will learn how to make a simple game out of it. Almost every tutorial is designed around actually making a single game, so that's a perfectly viable place to start. I would also play around and improve on that game. Beyond the tutorial, you're like, okay, I learned it. Maybe if I can add a double jump to this tutorial, that'd be great. And that's actually really useful to know because now you have to keep count of how many times you tap the jump button after you're off the ground, because you don't want infinite air jumps, which is a very easy mistake to make. And then finally, now will be, after like you got this basis, now would be a good time to start really searching and diving into how do I make the dream game project that I have. And And this will basically involve looking for any tutorials on very specific features that exist on the game engine that will significantly make the game easier for you. Let's say, for example, you want to make like a real-time turn-based, a real-time strategy game. Then pathfinding becomes a very important problem. By pathfinding, we're talking about finding the shortest path from point A to point B when there's like swamps, mountains in the way, and you want to get a troop of like 100 units getting to point B, right? You can try programming that, or you can try to see if your game engine has a pathfinding algorithm already embedded in it and learn the workflow of how to make that. Again, one example, there are plenty of other examples out there. It's also good to learn on how much work you have to do anyways, because like those features may or may not exist. And then, once you figured out what those features are, learn, kind of practice on each of those features. I personally like to do a game jam on a specific feature, focusing on a specific feature, and just kind of really learn the ins and outs of that. That's one way of doing it, but you can always take that at your own pace. And finally, make a lot of games. Making games is an iterative process. Chances are very high that dream game project is probably not going to be made overnight. For that matter, it's probably not going to be made the first time you're going to attempt to make it. I know for me, I just kind of gave up on my dream project after spending too long on it and just kind of tried a couple of other random things before trying to tackle it again. And like I said, there's a perfectly viable plan on getting towards that goal.
Yeah, totally.
All right, finally, questions and answers. There's inevitably going to be a lot of questions. But before I quickly do that, about this slide. So I'll give you one more opportunity to take photos of it. Yes, I mentioned I did have a logic in sorting this, more like grouping it. Back. No! My goodness. Sorry, technical problems. I do need the mouse visible. Here we go. So all of these game engines right here are 3D generalist game engines, with the last two being open source. Actually, last three. I think Torque 3D is also open source as well. And then everything below that is generalist 2D game engines that are also fairly easy to learn. I think all of them are, you don't need to know programming to get started stuff, so that's actually really good. Almost everything in the middle right here is some sort of programming, or some sort of framework that you can program on top of.
Smaller, less comprehensive.
Exception being, I think, Stencil and BuildBox. I have not researched very thoroughly on those, but I believe those are movies. And finally, the rightmost, the majority of them are specialized stuff. RPG Maker MV for your RPG stuff. I think Paper Maker is an open source project. It may or may not be defunct, but I found it an alternative to .NET, so it must be true. Adventure Game Studio is the aforementioned Point and Click Adventure. RemPie is visual novels. Huh? Excuse me. Adventure Game Studio is Point and Click. RemPie is RemPie and Tyranno Builder actually are both visual novel game engines. I believe the former is open source and free. I think Tyranno Builder is paid. Twine is great for text adventures. Bitsy is kind of good for, it's a little strange, like a exploration.
It's like super simple 8-bit kind
Yeah.
of game.
Blender is actually a 3D modeling tool, but as of 2.79, it is technically possible to make games. Armory 3D is actually Blender with the game engine kept while trying to update it to 2.8 beta, because they pretty much threw the whole game engine stuff out for 2.8 Blender. Play Canvas is interesting. You need to know JavaScript to program it, but the entire game engine is online and it's designed be able to be shared with the team. And Roblox, because Roblox.
Very, very popular. I don't know, but yeah.
All right, questions? Any questions? Fantastic. Wow, there's a lot.
Let's.
Okay, so in the list of the list of game engines you use and what reasons, you list for 3D you listed Unity, Unreal, Zynga, and Donut. But where was the one where you're writing your phone? Like what?
Don't use those. No, I'm serious. If you have not used a game engine before, don't even bother. I wouldn't. It's way too complex.
They're very advanced.
Yes.
Yeah. But they're like generalist and also very advanced. So it's like a weird. Yeah.
Guys, back, stay away. Yeah, CryEngine and Lumberyard basically similar.
Let's get it back at here.
When making your own game engine, what's really like the best way to start off?
So the question is, what's the best way to start off in making your own game engine? Right?
Yeah, so I noticed there's a lot of engineers in the room, and maybe you're kind of in the same place where I was, where, so 10 years ago, I made a lot of, I could demo if you want, but wait, what was the question again?
What's a good way to start off?
Okay, yeah. So 10 years ago or so, I had made a lot of small games, but I had my own kind of framework type of thing that I would carry. I would like copy and paste. Okay, I'm gonna start a new game. Let's copy and paste this other game that I made and use that as a starting point. And I kept doing that every time. And it was kind of annoying because I was like, oh, I fixed something in this game. And then I have to copy that into the other game to fix it in the other game because it uses some of the same code. And then I was like, you know what I should do is just kind of separate the engine from the game. So that's really your first step, is like looking at, I hope some of you guys have made games before, at least small games, kind of starting with what you have there and kind of break it off, split it off into your game engine part and your game part. In Visual Studio, I split it off into two separate projects. And the game engine gets built first, and then the game includes the game engine. And it's kind of that simple. You're going to need, I also would recommend starting in HTML5 if you want to make a small game engine, because most of the low-level stuff is taken care of. You can play sound in like one function call. You can render something very easily. But there might be some other little framework type of things that you want to, like there's no physics in HTML5. Maybe you want to, and I'm not talking like a complex physics for your game. Maybe you just want a character that can move around on the screen with a little bit of weight to it, like a Geometry Wars type of thing. You'll need that. And once you have that, you can use that for other games. So what I might do, I know there's a lot of other questions, but I'm going to get my game engine set up so I can do a quick demo for you guys of what it is.
Let's get the Booster question real quick. And then any other questions, we'll hang out here also if you guys want to ask.
Yeah.
Are there any genres of games that you wish there were specialized game engines for, but haven't found them?
Are there any genres of games that you wish there were special game engines for? Yeah, so that's like, yes, for me, like my games that I make are very unique and like specialized. So that's why I kind of got into writing my own engines. Because there's so many games that you can think of that don't have specialized
I actually was doing it and got it.
and you can't just sit there and be like, oh, I wish Unity would do that for me. Like, you can kind of do that for yourself. Yeah, good question.
So a lot of game engines in particular, do not do a great job of putting together a dialogue tree. So like you see a lot, especially in Unity, you see a lot of like tools that are just like, hey, this is a quick dialogue tree interpreter I just created. So that's definitely something almost every game engine I've touched, with an exception of RedPie because it's obviously been designed for that purpose. Or like, yeah, we don't have this, you're gonna have to make your own.
Emphasize the difference between your game engine part and your game part.
I mean, it kind of depends what you're going to do, because some of these game engines we talked about have a lot of game stuff in it, like RPG Maker or something. It makes a lot of assumptions about the type of game you're going to make. So, depending on how many assumptions you want to make, like my game engine is pretty flexible, but it's a 2D game engine, so I made that assumption right off the bat. But there's no game-specific code in the game engine. So, yeah, so there's no code in the game engine that says what type of character you are, or like how they interact with the world exactly. There might be some base low-level stuff in the game engine for, like, for example, Unreal has something in the game engine called a character controller that makes a lot of assumptions about how a character moves around and jumps, and it can handle all that stuff and networking. But you don't have to use that. But it is in the game engine. But it's very generic, and you would use that same character controller for any type of, if you're making a Mario game, or if you're making a shooter, or whatever you're making. So a game engine is just very, very generic, and like, again, for my game engine, I keep going back to, I want to be able to not change the game engine and make all different types of games, if that makes sense. So you want to be able to, be flexible.
That's a good start.
Yeah, let's check out this demo.
Yeah, I can do a quick demo for you guys. If you want to stop by my MABS booth, I could give a more advanced demo. But basically what we got is can you see it okay? Okay, good. So we got a 2D tile engine here. And as you can see, it supports a pretty large world. I've been working on this game engine for about 10 years. But a lot of what you see I've had within the first couple of months. So I have 3 different tile layers, and the way the tile rendering works is a little different because I don't have to have square tiles. I can draw tiles in like this. I kind of can support a cut in between in each square tile, and I have a really fast iteration thing. So if you want to fill that in, if you want to just jump into that and test it, oh wait, I can make it even faster. So. I usually turn that off. This is my debug console, which I also made. We haven't mentioned it, but most game engines have a debug console. And what I can do is add commands to it really easily, and I just type in. That means the next time I start up the engine, this command that I just done will automatically execute. So let's switch back. Okay. So this is how I do iteration. I just jump in and back and forth, and I'm able to really quickly just jump around the world, as you can see, and that makes it super easy.
Wherever your mouse is, right?
Wherever my mouse is, that's what I eventually came down to. I used to have a button, and I'm like, oh, I want to get rid of those things. Okay, let's try that. Okay, let's place some enemies. I'll show you how that works. So there's 3 layers. There's a background tile layer. So that's I can undo. I have an undo and redo and all that stuff, and that was kind of one of the hardest features to do. I didn't actually do that until many years after I had already made the game engine. So this is the background layer. Then you have a foreground layer. This is just for the tiles. And the reason that I'm using tiles for that is because it's very efficient to render and do the physics of the tiles. Let me show you how the physics works really quick. So this is showing you all the physics. And you'll notice that each one of these tiles isn't a square. It actually builds a larger rectangle if possible, which cuts down on the amount of physics. I'm not used to working with this surface here. It's a little bit weird. Camera, manual override, okay. Yeah, you can zoom out and see, this engine is actually streamed in real time, so I'm just going to move around and let you see how it streams in. So as you can see, as you move to like a new grid space, it will, yeah, it'll generate the physics. You can see these red lines are kind of dividing the world up into a grid, and for this particular game, I have a window of a 5x5 window where the player is always just in the center, and then I just kind of stream in whatever is around the player there. I have all these function buttons, turn off physics. I want to show you how to place an enemy really quick. I think that'll be a good thing to do. So the first 2 layers are tiles. The 3rd layer is for objects. And I can place enemies here, like place some of these dudes, and now I have enemies, and it's really that simple. And I can copy and paste, I can move stuff around. I'm not really used to using this service, it's a little weird. Move stuff around. I can, in addition to enemies and stuff, I can place like triggers, music triggers, doors, pretty much everything is an object stub. And this is just a lightweight version of the object that doesn't run any of the object's code. It just is like a placeholder that says, when you spawn in, create these objects in these places. Is there any other specific features you guys want to see? I'd be happy to show more later. We're running out of time, so. The code is already written. The code for the game engine is already written, but the code for the game is what I'm working on. The code for the game is actually C++ code, but it's separate from the game engine. But this doesn't. This is not generating any code right now. What you guys are seeing. No, I don't package it all up. This is the entire game. This is the entire game engine. Some game engines you will package up. This particular game engine, there's no packaging step. It's all there. It's just that is all that is.
Does this create some sort of data file?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, so this entire level here gets dumped out to a data file, which contains all of the tiles for layer 1 and 2, and then all of the objects that I've placed, and then a couple other things. But that's like the entire data file, and it's a couple things. Yeah, my game engine interprets it, reads it in. I mean, if you can imagine, the tiles are pretty easy to understand. That's just like an array, a grid of data.
What about the scripting event?
Well, this game engine doesn't actually support scripting currently. I use C++ for all that stuff. Most other game engines do, but again, this is my game engine that really I'm the only one that uses, so I just write everything in C++. Yeah.
So what was your question? Last point?
Yeah, sure. Frank, man, this looks awesome.
Oh,
It
thanks.
looks like a legacy of, like you said, 10 years of work.
Yeah.
Right? One of the things that you guys mentioned about open source, and Zenko I don't know of for certainly Godot, is the idea that they're built on GPL, right? The new public license. How much of that are you then required to make open source when you publish your game?
Sure, yeah, I mean, it really depends on the license. These guys might be able to answer that. Check.
So with the GPL, your engine is pretty much where they draw the line. The assets that your game is built on isn't technically part of the engine that you're receiving. So only whatever's in the source control that you're getting from the engine producer is technically part of what's under the GPL. Some engines may do it differently. They might require that parts of the assets are included. Some engines might include assets separately and require that you take them in which case you can't use those assets in your GPL version of the game. Only they can. So it really depends on what the producers of the engine have brought into play.
And having recently researched Godot, I can tell you from the licensing page that for Godot, basically you can do whatever you want. You can even fork your own private version of Godot and make your own private modifications to the engine. And there's no need to share it out if you don't want to.
Generally, MIT, BSD, and Apache licenses are more like that, where you can just fork it, do whatever you want. GPL is the more restrictive one, where you have to be careful about copyleft and making sure that you provide your own source code with it as well.
Coincidentally, Zenko is the same thing. If you make a game out of it, you're allowed to do it. If you compile the game engine itself and added some changes, that's what becomes relevant to sharing.
Another things I wanted to show you guys really quick. So, because you asked about scripting, and some of these enemies have different about them. Like, you want to make an enemy a little faster, you want to change the type of an enemy, or you want to, do whatever. So I have a way of doing that in my game engine. Some people might say this is bad, but I actually really like it. I have just one field. Like, a lot of game engines will have like a ton of fields and things to edit. I have just one text box. And every object has different attributes in that text box, but it's just a plain text box. And you can see how it's highlighted dummy right now in red. These are the attributes of the thing. So if I want to change this type of enemy, let me just show you what he is right now. So he's a fast, like yellow enemy. So I happen to know what it is. You kind of have to know what it is for your game, but different for every game. So I can change the type of enemy. Let's make him a. So I can change hidden. I can make him like. Let's make him like really fast.
And the general behaviors and
Yes, exactly, yeah. So I just wanted to show you guys how like changing attributes work. So, and that's different for every type of thing. So for example, this moving platform here, I can control like what is the X and Y. Now it's moving 13 in the X, what if we move it 10 in the Y as well? What if I change its speed? You know, these are just values that I'm changing. And just to give you an example of how simple things can be if you want it to be. Also, one other thing I really wanted to mention is that part of my philosophy of games is that making games should be fun. And I think that really starts with the engine itself. And because I think that if you make a game and you have fun making it, there's a much better chance that the game itself is going to be fun. And even if it's not fun, well, at least you have fun making it, because trust me, I have worked on a lot of games that were not fun to make. And I think, like I said, it begins with the game engine, and it really gets down to iteration. How fast can you iterate? If you're an artist, that means how fast can you get your stuff in the game and see it. If you're a designer, it means how fast can I make the level and make changes and undo and edit, copy and paste. If you're an engineer, it means how fast can I get a piece of code that I just wrote into the game and make a change happen. That is what will make the game much funner. But once you understand how the engine works, it really just comes down to how fast does it take to iterate.
Yeah, totally. And like, basically the whole point is don't be afraid to get into the guts of a game engine. Try different game engines to find the one that really is fun and really fits your work.
Apologies, we're kind of over time, but if you have
We'll be
any
here
more
for-
questions, feel free to walk up to us.
All right, thanks for coming.